welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the UK-based leftist Christian podcast that now supports footballers accused of racially aggravated harassment. I'm Ben Molyneux-Hetherington, and I'm joined by Adam Spears. Adam, have you been following the story of Sam Kerr?
Oh, that's what you were talking about. Yeah.
You didn't think I was just going to be like, I think it's great when footballers are racist.
Are we getting behind this? Is that what we are now? That evil racist Sam Kerr.
Look, on a surface level, an Australian football player who plays for Chelsea got accused of being racist. It's reasonable.
You could see it,
Sure, probably. That makes sense. It all tracks. And then it turned out that Sam Kerr is a mixed race person who was accused of being racist because she called a police officer stupid and white.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it, and A, it was accurate, and B, it's usually accurate.
Yeah. Like, the police officer was white and was a police officer, so therefore, it's an entirely accurate thing. And actually, it came in the context of her trying to explain the racial power dynamics whilst quite drunk, in all fairness. But as any one of us who has been a bit pissed and tried to explain something probably too complicated for that time of night can attest to, you don't always pick the perfect words, but you can kind of see what she was driving at.
Yeah, I mean, she was right.
And the court agreed. She was found not guilty, which is good.
I honestly thought she was going to be found guilty because, the law is not actually set up in that way. I knew a guy who was accused of something. He was accused of something not dissimilar by the police, and he was convicted.
Yeah.
And, he was wrong to say what he said, but
to call it racist.
The charge against him was incorrect because he called someone, he said that he had a problem with a police officer because they were Welsh or something. And I'm like, you shouldn't say that. That's not okay, but it's not racism.
Yeah.
Xenophobia, fine, right? Absolutely. And that was wrong and he shouldn't have done it. And there were other things that he shouldn't have done that were much worse than that.
Pablo Escobar is the friend you're talking about.
Yeah.
Really hated the Welsh, that guy. I don't know why.
I mean, I was going to say he's worse than Pablo Escobar. I don't know.
Let's not even get into the moral equivalency of Pablo Escobar.
Yeah.
I think the other thing about the story that you can draw your own conclusions from is that the police officer in question didn't mention the stupid and white comment until 11 months after the event.
Yeah, and it was it really hurt my feelings or whatever. Come on.
But it took me 11 months to process that what had happened to me was that deeply offensive. And for some reason, that timeline matched with the CPS originally deciding not to prosecute and then me having a sudden moment of realization. I mean, sometimes it takes time to process traumatic experiences, but it does look a little convenient. And I think he was asked in court, basically, did you want to see this person prosecuted? And he was just like, yeah, that's what I wanted. So, yeah, I think there's no question.
Of course he did. He's a pig.
Yeah.
Of course he did.
Yeah, a whole ridiculous situation. I'm glad she was found not guilty. And
she is guilty of playing for Chelsea, though. So
yeah. And I think, you might think, it's women's football, you should be nice. But actually, if we want to take women's football as seriously as we take men's football, which we should do, then I'm afraid that women Chelsea players are also scum. That's the...
She's a quality player, though. I mean... Did you see that goal she scored against England when they played in the World Cup?
Yeah, another reason to hate her. I agree.
Yeah, okay, if we're going to get all nationalist about it, then sure. Yeah, I was cheer for England.
It was against Australia. You know what I'm saying? Obviously, I wouldn't cheer against England. Wouldn't cheer for England against a South American team.
Yeah, and if the Australian team was made up of entirely Aboriginal players, then maybe. But I don't think it was.
No, I suspect... Well, I don't think Sam Kerr is Aboriginal, so yeah. But, probably the advice here is don't try and explain something to a police officer. Unfortunately, you probably just have to say, yes, sir, or shut your mouth and walk away from whatever situation. Because, they will take what you say.
I've had a lot of conversations with police officers. I take the route when I'm on, protest or whatever. I'm always very careful about what I tell them. Because the whole thing is, you don't talk to the cops because they're always fishing, right?
Yeah.
But I'm aware of that, so I do talk to them, partly because I find it quite funny, and partly because I'm fishing as well. And I remember I was protesting Charles Windsor visiting where I was living at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And a police officer came up and they were on me because there was like two of us. There was me and this other guy there protesting, and I had a sign, and this police officer was like just on me, and he just sort of shadowed me the entire time because I was clearly such a threat.
Yeah.
And when Charles and what's her face, Camilla, were walking past, he stole my sign. This police officer, he stole my sign, and I'm like, "What are you doing?"
Maybe he wanted to protest too.
Yeah, maybe. No, he said, "Oh, we're just going to take your sign just whilst the royals are passing." And I'm like, "Why do you think I've got the sign here?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, I'm gonna if I can't share my message, I'll just shout my message." And he's like, "No, because you'll get arrested." And I'm like, "Arrested for what?" And he's like, "A breach of the peace." And
as I say, breach of the peace.
How would that be breaching the peace? You know, how's that going to... Because he's like, "Oh, it's going to cause people to become violent." And I'm like, so what you're saying is other people are going to breach the peace, so you're going to arrest me, right? But the thing is, when you talk to a police officer in those, it's like the words are just going boing, boing off their head, you know? So I know what it must have been like, especially if she was drunk as well.
And for those of you doing your bread and rosaries bingo card at home, you can tick off Adam twists the topic to talk about the royal family.
It wasn't about the royal family. Oh, so they're not royal. They're just a family. They're just normal people who happen to be highly, highly bred.
I'm not even touching that. I'm just moving on. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the religious right and what it might look like in the UK as a movement.
Doesn't exist.
And yes, riff off an interesting but flawed report discussing the presence of the religious right in the UK to kind of discuss that phenomenon. But before we do that, Adam, I believe you have something on your mind, Grapes.
What else is on my mind, Grapes?
So I have been noticing a few things on the fascist hellscape that is Elon Musk's former Twitter site. I have a friend on there who I actually met. Right. A friend of mine is on there. She is a priest in the Church of England, and she tweeted a tweet where she was holding like an inclusive church service. She tweeted a photo that she had shared of all the people that she was doing this service with, and the altar frontal was a Progress Pride flag.
So can we pause there? Altar frontal being what the rest of us would refer to as the tablecloth on the table they do communion on, yeah?
You heathen.
Yeah, what can I say?
So she tweeted that picture, and then a gentleman who we have discussed on the podcast before by the name...
Hover your finger over the bleep.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to say the word I'm not allowed to say on the podcast.
Okay. The Reverend Dr. Ian Paul. Go on in. Retweeted this tweet and basically just having a go at her, saying it's awful and whatever. And obviously she's got an absolute shitstorm from just because this Ian Paul guy has retweeted it, and he said that it's a sad misuse of the communion table, and the table's already open to all, and that it's wrong and offensive.
And then tons of the rabid proto-fascist Anglicans that follow him are jumping
Piling
on it.
Yeah.
Just for context, Ian Paul is a priest in the Church of England. He
is a what?
Is he not a priest?
No, I know. I was expecting you to say again. That's all.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Queuing you up.
No. The only thing worse than calling him that is calling him a priest in the Church of England. Yeah. That's an even higher level of insult.
That is true. Yeah.
But he is also on the Archbishop's Council and is one of the people that survivors of sexual abuse in the Church of England have been calling for the head of. And he has been a real bellend about the whole thing. I disliked him before that. I'm very much a hipster when it comes to disliking Ian Paul, but he has really not covered himself in glory and has basically, he went on some news program and kind of went, yeah, things are basically fine safeguarding wise in the Church of England. And so, yeah, he is someone right at the centre of the safeguarding scandals in the Church of England.
Yeah.
But what's a disgrace is not that he and his cronies have allowed people to get away with abusing people, but that someone might suggest that gay people and trans people are welcome in the church.
And this is the thing, right? So I have actually trying to navigate the site formerly known as Twitter after Elon Musk has got his grubby webbed claws on it is really hard. But I have now found the tweet in question.
Okay.
And I'm not going to talk too much about it. Actually, I think I will probably bleep her name out because...
But then it'll sound like you're calling her.
That's true. Let me tell you something about the person who originally tweeted this. She is one of the loveliest people you will meet. She's a very rare in the Church of England working class priest who's just been serving her community, serving LGBTQ plus people in her community for years in really wonderful ways. And she doesn't need this shit. There was a part of me that didn't know ever actually wanted to talk about this, but people like Ian Paul don't listen to us, so I'm sure it's fine.
And if he does, I want him to know how much I hate him. I dislike you so intently, Ian Paul.
But one of the interesting things about this is the headline in Premier Christian News is Church receives backlash for putting trans flag on communion table. Now, the Progress Pride flag is a trans flag in the sense that it includes trans people on it, but it is not just a trans flag. But that is the culture war issue at the moment, and I think that says a lot.
I also think, potentially the people who work at Premier Christian News are not super up on the different sorts of flags for queer solidarity.
Possibly not. I mean, I think it depends. I think there are one or two decent journalists for Premier, but also, I mean, I've complained to them before because they platform people like Ian Paul and just out and out fascists and stuff, which I just think is outrageous and disgraceful. And their whole thing is just that very liberal response of we show a range of views. It's that liberal BBC neutrality kind of thing where they think they're being neutral, but really what they're doing is just upholding the status quo and giving voice to reactionaries.
There was a really revealing bit in that article where they quote the priest as saying, I love these folks and so does God. And then it says, Reverend Dr. Ian Paul disagreed. And I think they're trying to say he disagreed with the idea more generally that this was okay, but it 100% comes across as Ian Paul saying, no, God doesn't love these people. And I think, he's tried to do the whole, actually, this is about the rules of the Church of England. You're not allowed to have tablecloths that are outside of the rules for tablecloths. And first of all...
But this is not outside of the rules, by the way. It's not outside of the rules.
But even if it is, you just sound like a loser when you say stuff like that. You just sound like a complete loser. Like, oh, it's outside the rules of what tablecloths are allowed to use. Shut up. Sorry to our high church listeners, but come on now. And secondly, it's not really about that, because if, for example, someone put a British flag, I'm sure Ian Paul would say, I do have a problem with that, but the response would not have been the same. There would have not been the same level of criticism. Someone might have got a rap on the knuckles or talking to, but it is, as you say, it's all culture war nonsense.
Do you think he would have had a problem if it was a union flag?
I think if someone said to him, Ian, this person has also broken the rules by putting the union flag on it.
No.
He would then go, well, I disagree with that as well.
Yeah.
I doubt he'd have made a big deal out of it publicly unless he was directly asked to. And obviously the response would have been different. You wouldn't have had the same bunch of dickhead online losers attacking this poor woman as you did in this case.
Dickhead online losers. I feel attacked, to be honest.
Hey, you were a loser before online existed, Adam. Have some self-respect.
Yeah. So anyway, solidarity with everyone, actually, who is, because there are others, obviously, just standing in solidarity, especially with trans people at this time, but with the LGBTQ plus community as a whole, doing that, especially from within the church like this, solidarity all day long.
And we will continue to hold the line, absolutely, on defending and supporting trans people. That is a non-negotiable line, and I would hope that's very clear from what we talk about, but given the increasing pushback against trans rights, it's worth stating directly, TERFs, eat shit and die.
But also, there's a part of me that hates talking about these things because I don't want to have the fight on the culture war issues that the right wing want to have the fight on. Because the whole reason they always focus on the culture war is because they're trying to get us to stop focusing on the
class war.
Yeah, class war. So I always want to caveat this and to sit this within the context of class war.
Yeah.
And this is not to say that I'm a class
reductionist.
But it is to say that this is what they don't want us to talk about. And so the solidarity comes from the place of saying, no, we need to band together no matter who we are, no matter what we look like, no matter who we love or our gender identity or whatever it is, to have that class war.
That kind of segues us nicely into what we're going to talk about today, which is the religious right. And I think it's really important to understand that we're talking about the religious right, as we will kind of see in depth now. They exist to push culture war narratives in service of a support of capitalism. And that doesn't mean they're all necessarily aware they're doing that, but that is their function within the kind of structures that justify the continuing existence of capitalism. And so, as you say, there's this really difficult needle to thread that we are trying to thread, that, there is the anti-identity politics left who, that phrase you use, class reductionist. Everything is about class. If it's not about class, then it's not about the left. And that is just a stupid and unhelpful line to take. We don't want to be in a culture war, but we kind of are in one. And to not express solidarity with the victims of the culture war is to fail to look after people, which is kind of what we're meant to be doing. But at the same time, you don't want to get sucked in, because actually, as long as you're debating the culture war, as long as the only narrative is the culture war narrative, as you say, you're not dealing with the fundamental economic questions that it's not that they're more important necessarily than the culture war questions. It's that they underpin everything that's happening in the culture war.
Whilst a fragile ceasefire seems to be holding in Gaza, the struggle for a free Palestine is far from over. Violence in the West Bank, Israeli bans on aid agencies, and American imperialism are just a few of the threats to the safety and flourishing of Palestinian communities. We are daily inspired by the determination, steadfastness, and persistence of Palestinians. Christians for Palestine continues to organise a Christian presence at the national marches for Palestine, as well as working locally in grassroots movements for change. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com to get involved.
I have read a report because I don't value my time. And the report is entitled, Is There a Religious Right Emerging in the UK? It's written by a guy called Andy Walton and was published by Theos in 2013. It's obviously quite old. I think, however, it does provide a useful framework to kind of consider those questions. Overall, I think the answer to the question is very clear in the report, which is no. And I think the logic that leads the author to that point is quite faulty. And it's got some useful structures in there to look at why there is, in fact, a religious right in the UK. This is not going to be us going through why I don't like this report or think it's wrong, but I'm going to use that report as a bit of a way of structuring a conversation around the religious right. So it's not just a hatchet job, but I don't like this report. I think it's not as helpful as it could be, but nonetheless, it is worth going through. And I guess the main thrust of the argument is there isn't a religious right in the UK, because what people call the religious right functions very differently to how the American religious right functions, which is one of those arguments that on the face of it seems reasonable. But when you delve down into it, you could take away the word religious there and it's the same argument. Or there's no conservatism in the UK, because how conservatism functions in the UK is not the same as how it functions in America. Because we don't have a Donald Trump situation, we therefore don't have any conservatism in the UK. And that's pretty obviously an absurd statement, but it's much the same. I think one of the things that we've kind of harped on about a lot on this podcast over the years is there was a lot of really useful analysis coming out of the States, but there's work needed to take that analysis and translate it to a British context where things don't look the same as they look in the States, even if the underlying forces that create these situations are still present.
Sorry, I've just looking at it now, and one thing has jumped out at me, and it's the words Andrea Minicello Williams.
Yes, there is a definite rogues gallery element to what we're looking at today.
Stephen Green as well.
There are some familiar faces and organisations from previous episodes are going to rear their ugly heads again. We will get to that. Don't you worry. Let's just start with a bit of a brief, extremely brief history of the religious right. So the US religious right comes together in the 70s, kind of responding to a number of things, particularly civil rights and desegregation. They have kind of segregated schools and various other things. There is some suggestion that there's also tax elements at play here. You know, there was threats to kind of Christian private school tax breaks because they were not desegregating. But yeah, there's this kind of desire to impact politics and a recognition that they can't approach it directly because the civil rights movement has had some success. And it is not a particularly good idea to just say, as Christians, we need to oppose the civil rights movement. That is not going to work particularly well. And instead, they hit upon the issue as abortion, to build a coalition of Christians on conservative politics using the abortion issue as the thing that kind of brings everyone together. People do not realise this, but actually until the 70s, abortion was really a non-issue for evangelicals. Evangelicals in America viewed caring about abortion as kind of a weird Catholic hang-up. There was a general understanding that the status quo in terms of kind of Roe v. Wade holding, so limited abortion in particular situations, was fine. You know, if you read some kind of older, early 20th century to mid 20th century, more conservative Christian theology on the subject of abortion, they are far more nuanced than the modern stuff that comes up. You know, they are far more willing to accept there are situations where it might need to happen. So abortion becomes the defining issue of the religious right. It's not the thing they actually care about, but it's the issue they think they can use to unite. Particularly, obviously, it helps bring Catholics into the fold as well, which is a minority, but are present in that coalition. And to begin with, the two big names in it are Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, who are two kind of the big televangelists.
Oh, we need a boo button, don't we?
And then as their influence fades, James Dobson and Focus on the Family kind of take over. Focus on the Family was a daily radio show with a massive reach hosted by James Dobson, really preaching some foul stuff about families, you know, stuff that I think I would say in this day and age, probably back then as well, would reasonably be considered to be abuse. Plenty of stuff about physical punishment for children, you know, and we're not just talking kind of light spanking, which again, I don't think you should do, but, you know, at that point in time was perhaps more the norm. We are talking about, you know, physical abuse in short. So those are the kind of three big people, and it has been considered to be a really influential movement within American politics. Its influence was seen to have kind of faded, particularly around the Obama era. But I think what you're seeing with the Trump movement at the minute is the bastard offspring of the religious right. You know, it is not the same people. It is not a direct inheritance, but it is people who are profoundly shaped by the legacy of the religious right, but are taking it in new and unpleasant directions. So that is an exceptionally whistle-stop tour of the religious right. And I think, you know, the first thing, obviously, to point out in that history is that we do not have a history of televangelism in the UK or kind of big Christian radio in the UK. there are, you've got your God TVs and whatever, and you've got Premier Christian Radio and UCBs. And I think it's telling that there will be probably a decent chunk of people listening to this who have no idea of any of the broadcasters that I've just named, right? These are not, and there are people who go, oh God, yeah.
Don't go and look them up.
The only reason normal people know about God TV is they were looking for the porn channels and got really deep into the numbers on the satellite dish. That is, these are not big influential organisations. And so if you're saying that a UK religious right has to look exactly like the US religious right, then obviously it's not going to happen. We do not have a Pat Robertson or a Jerry Falwell equivalent in the UK. A small note of patriotism, maybe? or at least not abject shame in our country about that. That's for various kind of material reasons to do with the size of the country and the kind of social approach to religion, even amongst evangelicals in the country. But I would want to argue that is to look at the symptoms, not the disease. That Falwell and Robertson are representations of forces and currents in the culture that already existed, which is basically a need for Christians to reassert some power and dominance. The reality is that evangelicals, particularly white evangelicals in the States, because obviously this is quite a racial divide, they lose really badly in politics because they're not actively opposed to the civil rights movement, but they basically have no voice in it whatsoever. Even just cheering from the sidelines, it doesn't exist for them, and they can see, they're actually quite perceptive, really. They can see the erosion of the power and privilege that comes from being Christian well before it really kicks into gear as it does later in the 20th century and on into the 21st century, right? It is, but they can already see it moving, and this is an attempt to try and get back in the driving seat. And I think if you see it that way, you can absolutely see that force, that tide coming to bear on British politics right now.
Yeah, I think this is something that some of us have been warning about for some time, actually. And I think there's kind of a parallel that I've seen online where for ages, a lot of us have been screaming about how the far right are being given more and more oxygen, and how anyone who challenges the far right, well, like I challenge the far right all the time, and anytime I do, I'm immediately censored for that. Like, there is an issue with censorship, but it ain't like censoring the right wing. So anytime, like, we're at a point now where you can say a load of fascist stuff and that's fine, but as soon as you say to someone, hey, that's a load of fascist stuff, you get like your comments, your videos, all of it get taken down for like harassment and bullying and stuff. And I think there's a parallel there where we are allowing this stuff to fester because we're not challenging it, and those of us who do challenge it are called out for being rude or for being hysterical or something like that. And actually, it's a real problem. And if the people you're calling out are the ones who are the only people saying, hang on a minute, look at this over here, well, of course it's going to give more oxygen to it. Of course these movements are going to grow. And I think that's what we've seen as well with the
And I won't
Christian right.
Get sidetracked down this road, but I do think it's really perfect encapsulation of what we're saying about class war and culture war, in terms of when we talk about the fact that, you can't use language like cis on the website formerly known as Twitter without getting banned or your tweet blocked. There's various issues of kind of censorship and free speech on social media platforms. But fundamentally, those issues are about who owns media platforms. And, social media is not any different fundamentally to kind of legacy media, to broadcast and print media of all forms, right? The fundamental issue is that they are owned by individuals mostly, or kind of groups of shareholders, and that those people have the power to make those decisions. Yeah. So when we talk about the culture war, yes, it's really important to confront the fact that hate speech is increasingly acceptable on social media, and, a bunch of the social media bosses are all cozying up to Trump and all that sort of thing. But that is fundamentally as much an issue of ownership of the means of production, because that's what the media is, as it is just a culture war issue. So I think that's a really perfect example of what we're saying.
Yeah, and we are now in this very weird place where it is considered more offensive to call someone a fascist than it is to actually be a fascist, to actually do fascist stuff. And that is an extremely dangerous place to be.
I think if you were to take a surface level reading, you would say, well, we don't have televangelists or radio hosts that are big media personalities who can pull together a coalition. But the fundamental driving forces behind that, a erosion of Christian privilege and a feeling of having your place in the driver's seat of society taken away from you, is absolutely a driving force behind a lot of Christian engagement in politics in this country. They identify in the piece some characteristics of the religious right. And I think there's a good bit in there where they say, when we speak of the religious right, we're not simply referring to Christians who happen to be conservative in their politics. The US religious right is a coherent movement with identifiable leaders, objectors, and influence. Comprising religious and Republican leaders and groups, the religious right mobilizes adherents to action on issues that relate to their fundamental values. This set of issues has come to make up the battleground on which the so-called culture war is fought. And I think it's interesting because I think if that's your definition, a coherent movement with identifiable leaders, objectives, and influence, well, I can kind of see a lot of the groups that we've talked about in the past of this podcast, that might come up later, are groups that you could point to, people that you could point to, objectives and influence you could point to and say, that's a religious right. There is identification of several characteristics of the religious right in the US. The two big ones are that they are anti-abortion, and the report says anti-gay marriage, but I think that is a reflection of the point in time the report was written, and anti-queer would be a more helpful thing to kind of term it as. And I got to say, if you're saying there's no movement of right-wing Christians opposing queer people and abortion, then you maybe haven't been reading the news enough. Because I think particularly, as we kind of touched on earlier, the issue of trans inclusion, acceptance, and I guess liberation ultimately has been one where there has been huge right-wing Christian pushback against it. What's interesting about that is that it's very much a coalitional approach with non-religious groups, right? There is the original kind of anti-trans movement that we see today comes out of a kind of secular, non-religious kind of political tradition that isn't just a kind of family-first conservatism, but I mean, we could go on about the roots of that, but it has a very different kind of background. But the religious right in the UK, the Christian conservatives in the UK, are happy to form coalitions with that as the thin end of the wedge to also oppose gay marriage and abortion rights. And that is something that's pretty, if you know where to look, is pretty directly stated. This is not something that we're kind of saying, oh, I reckon that's what's happening. They're quite open that is the ultimate plan, is to start with trans rights and then look at abortion rights and gay marriage.
And actually, even groups that we wouldn't necessarily consider the furthest right in this country are against these kinds of issues. But one of the interesting things I think is, so it said in the report that in America they have sort of identifiable leaders. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's not so much of a thing over here. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the important things is to understand, like when you are an evangelical, when you're in the evangelical world, you sort of realize how much British evangelicalism gets from the US.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And there is a kind of, and it's definitely more one way than the other, but there is a kind of cross-pollination that goes on. And there's a parallel here, and also an important kind of aspect of it too, is, and one of the ways in which actually an element has gone from here over to America, and that is trans rights, right? Mm-hmm. The whole anti-trans thing really started off over here.
There's a reason that the Americans will call us Turf Island. Right?
Exactly. And they are trying to outdo us now, and I think doing quite a good job of it somehow, because it's awful here. But that is one of the few ways that it's gone the other way. but TERFs are organising with far-right Christians on this issue as well.
And not just far-right Christians, so that's really important to say, but people who consider themselves centre-right or even centre-left Christians.
Yeah, but,
And we know there's a relationship between anti-trans politics and fascism, but actually it's also a massive gateway and kind of a wedge issue where it's being used to take people who aren't necessarily natural bedfellows with the right, but it's a way of kind of taking them in that direction to begin with.
Well, and I think this is the thing, is you can see there are certain sort of very well-known figures, J.K. Rowling, and even like Elon Musk, right? That we always hear this thing about how like Elon Musk is the first person in history to be radicalized by his own app. But you can see in real time the same thing has happened to J.K. Rowling. She started off in this kind of like...
She was very New Labour.
Yeah, and even with the trans stuff, it was still not good, but it was more of a like, I have trans friends, but I'm not sure about this element of it. Whereas now it's just like really vitriolic, nasty stuff. And part of that is because she has been radicalized and she hangs out with the far right now. And we know she does. There's photographs of it. She's giving support to them,
And that's happening to famous figures, but it's also happening to just like normal people.
Yeah, exactly.
Who are, starting unsure about trans rights, and the right people are speaking to them, or rather the wrong people are speaking to them and using their discomfort to, as you say, radicalise them to the right.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the lack of identifiable leaders in the UK. And whilst there are people that we could absolutely identify as leaders, they don't have the same prominence in the movement. They don't have the same kind of reach or influence. But I think that's an economic situation. The roots of that are the fact that actually if you're a professional Christian in this country, you do have to work a bit harder than an American professional Christian, I'm afraid. Because if you're Pat Robinson or Jerry Falwell, you are heading up a huge organisation of a TV network, right? And you don't run a TV network with a skeleton crew. We talked about the Evangelical Alliance on the last episode, and, we discussed how they're not a massive... They're a medium-sized charity. They're not small when it's just imagination, but they are not a huge organisation, And actually, even if you're the head of the Evangelical Alliance, you are going to actually be doing the work of the Evangelical Alliance. Like, you are not just someone who gets the title and is therefore able to use that as the kind of bully pulpit to spread a message in the way that Falwell and Robertson were able to do as the head of broadcast networks, right? You do not have a big enough organisation that you can just push off all the actual work to other people and just be the guy spouting your propaganda. And so I think, you don't have these identifiable leaders, but that's to do with economies of scale, right? Like, you do not have the size of organizations that a country like the US, with its population and size and prosperity, is able to conjure up. Even the biggest organizations are not fundamentally that big.
Also, though, there's something to be said here for trying to understand. I need a better word for this, but when we are thinking about economies of scale, how actually a lot more things operate in a grassroots fashion, and how like there are people making plans and working together in groups and so on that are trying to change things, as in like, in a bad way, but they have to do it on the DL, behind the scenes and so on. And I think one of the blind spots of this report, possibly because it's 2013 it was written, but actually I don't think that's much of an excuse for this. But one of the blind spots for this report is social media. It barely talks about social media, if at all.
I think there's an element of this being 2013. And I'm not saying social media wasn't prominent at that point, but it doesn't have the same political valence.
But I was writing essays and dissertations talking about the far right that referenced a lot of social media stuff at that same time. I wasn't writing huge reports on it like this, but I was writing essays on it. And if I could spot that as a, frankly, kind of rubbish university student, I don't know why they couldn't spot that for this report.
Yeah, I think you're right to some extent, but I think you're right. The decentralization, if you're looking for an incredibly centralized organization like they have in the US, you're not going to find it. So I think the reason they don't mention social media in the report is because they're not looking for different expressions of this movement. They are looking for a centralized movement rather than, as you say, this much more social media led, decentralized kind of thing, which then leaks into other forms of media. And your parents and grandparents are reading stuff about how Christianity has basically been banned in this country, and they're reading it in their traditional newspapers, not aware that that's a talking point that has started out on far-right social media. So, to return to the religious right and its presence in the UK, this report that we're talking about identifies some reasons as to why the UK doesn't have a religious right. And so I think we're just going to go through some of these reasons and talk about how actually they don't quite work out.
Is one of them the Queen? Because I see people genuinely use that as a in Britain we have the Queen who really operates as to keep politics in check, and I'm like, fuck off.
People have already ticked their bingo card, Adam. Don't give them a second one. You don't get double points for that.
I just hate them, okay? Just let me hate the royal family. I'm allowed that.
So, one of the reasons it says is that the UK has less evangelical Christians, and those that it does have tend to define themselves in less political terms. So that the identity of the evangelical in the UK is not a fundamentally political one like it is in the States. And I think that there is a mistake in methodology here and a confusion between self-identification and reality. Because I think it would be absolutely fair to say that British evangelical Christians do not think of themselves as defined as a political grouping in the way that American evangelicals do. However, I think it is fair to say that inherently evangelical Christian is a political category or a political identification to some extent. That's not to say that all evangelical Christians in the UK have the same political views, any more than it is to say that all evangelical Christians in the States have the same political views. But it's the water that you swim in, it's the air you breathe, right? If you are in evangelicalism, the political discourses in which you participate are ones that, at the very least on social issues, tend to the right.
I think is a really important point in that, to kind of reiterate this thing of just because you don't identify a certain way doesn't mean that you are not that. And I see this all the time when I have discussions with people who are on the right, where they say, well, I'm not right-wing. And it's like, you might not think you're right-wing, but that's probably because you've been gradually indoctrinated over a period of like a few years, and you still think that you are either apolitical, as if such a thing can exist, or even, sort of liberal left,
Yeah. And I think the point that they're driving at is, well, the US religious right is a very powerful force in American politics, whereas the British religious right does not have that same direct level of influence because there's less evangelical Christians proportionally, and they don't fundamentally see themselves as a political grouping. But that's not a question of whether there is a religious right, it's a question of how effective it is. The US religious right is extraordinarily effective, but to not be as effective as it is not the same as not existing.
Well, it also, I'm not saying this is true, but there's an argument to be made that if you convince people of something without them realizing they've been convinced of it, without them realizing that they are now a part of something, that could arguably be more successful.
Yeah, and I think you see this all the time in terms of the American religious right argues explicitly from religious principles. The British religious right recognises that's not an effective approach. And I think the thing that I have seen this most clearly on recently is the argument about assisted dying. And we might delve into this in a bit more at some point. I think I've mentioned this in the past, but I absolutely in favour of assisted dying.
Who would you like to assist to die, Ben?
Well, I mean, look, man.
Any of the names in this report, perchance?
Actually, do you know what? It's partially a selfish thing because, I can see myself in a situation where I would want to choose the manner and timing of my death rather than be submitted to the ravages of whatever illness is eventually going to kill me, right? And I think if you're someone who is disabled, and this is something that's really interesting, where a lot of the talk is about disability groups and their opposition to it, without recognising that statistically disabled people are significantly more likely to support assisted dying, even if the groups that claim to represent them have been in opposition. Because disabled people recognise that at some point in a lot of people's lives, things start happening to you that you are not in control of, that your body is not something you can rely on forever.
I think what's often lost in this is that there is a nuance in that, right? So a lot of disabled people support it, but that doesn't mean that they don't have, nuanced opinions on this, right? You can support something in principle and say, well, this is how I would like it to come out in the wash. This is how I would like it to ultimately look. And there are still concerns that it could look a different way. Like, you might support it, but you might not support XYZ version of it.
Sure.
That's where the nuance is, actually, rather than just saying, no, disabled people don't support it. Done.
Yeah. And I think, what we've seen in the debate around assisted dying is that nuanced conversation has been pretty much non-existent, because there is, a lobby of people who have been throwing whatever shit they can get their hands off at the assisted dying bill. And, I'm not an expert on the particular bill, and maybe it's good, maybe it's not. Maybe it has issues. I wouldn't be able to tell you. But there have been a lot of people who have opposed the assisted dying bill on what appear to be secular grounds. Oh, I'm concerned about disabled people. Oh, I'm concerned about slippery slope, all this sort of thing. And the reality is, most of these people fundamentally oppose assisted dying because of their Christian religious beliefs. And the push against the current assisted dying bill is driven in large part by conservative Christians. However, they do not enter the debate as conservative Christians. They enter it as concerned citizens and are frankly deeply disingenuous about their real motivations. And I think that's a really strong example of what we're talking about here. When your power is diffuse, when you do not have a large and coherent block of people that form your political base, you have to find other ways to influence political discourse in the country. And I think the main way is through Christians from Christian organizations, or frankly, a bunch of priests, bishops, pastors who are opposing the assisted dying bill, but making their argument in non-religious terms. And it's exactly the same thing that happened in the gay marriage debate when that was passed. Sure, there were some Christians who just went, God hates gay people, God will punish the UK if we allow this to pass. However, the general argument from people who were essentially opposed on religious grounds was, well, actually, I think it's unhealthy for society, it's not healthy, it's not going to do this, it's not going to do that. Arguing on supposedly secular grounds, but fundamentally opposing on a religious basis, right? And I think that is a huge part of what the religious right functions as in the UK. And it's why it's easy to go, well, there's not a religious right, because what there is a bunch of Christians espousing Christian right viewpoints, but not doing it explicitly as Christians or from a Christian view.
I think it's a really tricky thing, though, because I think you're right. I don't disagree with you at all. But generally, I think we both want a relatively sort of pluralistic society. And I think I'm someone who likes there to be religious voices talking on particular issues within read. I like those religious voices to be, left-wing religious voices, but I like a plurality of voices. And I think whilst you're absolutely right, it's sort of complicated because nobody's opinions are formed in a vacuum, right? Like they are all informed by every aspect of who we are and what we experience, and by thinking XYZ on this thing and whatever it is on another thing. How do we get to the point where we sort of recognize that is what's happening? What you're describing is a real phenomenon, but at the same time welcoming the sort of plurality of voices and the fact that they are formed in relation to all these kinds of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I kind of get what you're saying. It's in some ways the American picture is easier to analyse because it's simpler. Here was a group of people explicitly identifying as a Christian right religious political movement. And whilst, there's a lot to analyse in terms of the motivations and how it functions, all that sort of thing, it is at least, fundamentally honest, I suppose, about what it's doing. And fundamentally, I guess, it's not necessarily that the British religious right is inherently dishonest, but maybe doesn't have that self-awareness. We're talking about this stuff, and it's important to say that not everyone who is doing this stuff is aware that they're doing it for the reasons that we're outlining, right?
Yeah.
People do not necessarily have the self-awareness and the knowledge of what we'd call capitalist subjectivity to know that they are functioning in ways that support the upholding of capitalism.
Yeah.
The next reason why there isn't a religious right in the UK, according to this report, is that although Christians tend to be more socially conservative, they actually run the gamut from conservative viewpoints to quite significant centre-left viewpoints, which again I think is an accurate statement. But it kind of harks back to what we were saying before, that actually that's a lack of power and a lack of coherence in the movement rather than the non-existence of the movement. And I think it's important to say that, like we said earlier, when you're an evangelical Christian, or actually any sort of Christian in this country, to be honest, if your natural inclination is towards being centre-left, you may find yourself maybe holding centre-left economic views, but because you are surrounded by discourses around cultural issues that are deeply conservative, you will end up potentially being further to the right on those issues as a result of the work of the religious right in the UK.
Oh, and you can see that all the time. Yeah. Every single one of us is susceptible to propaganda and the sort of drip, drip, drip effects of that. Like, it matters. I'm sounding like a sort of right-wing Christian, sort of warning like a teenager about the music they listen to, But like, the more you hang around or the more you listen to talking points from a particular place, the more you are going to start thinking, oh, well, that is starting to make sense, And we do that without realizing it. And the amount of people that are getting radicalized online through that very process and not realizing that they've been radicalized, because who honestly goes and checks the background of everyone they're listening to and watching, and who can hear the dog whistles without having deliberately looked into what the dog whistles are, you can't expect the average person to pick up on this stuff. It's actually, there's a very similar thing I think that happens a lot of the time with, you're seeing a lot of churches in the Church of England now getting vicars who they don't see the warning signs of who they're getting. So a church I was a member of some years ago got a new vicar who trained at Oak Hill. Now, that church had not had vicars from Oak Hill before.
Tell us about Oak Hill. I don't know what Oak Hill is.
Okay, so in the Church of England, when you train to be a vicar, you can choose with your DDO, that's the Diocesan Director of Ordinance, the person who's in charge of your training, and the bishop, what college you're going to go and train at. There are colleges running the full gamut of Christian theology and beliefs within the Church of England. At one end, you've got a very conservative Catholic college in somewhere like St. Stephen's House, which is also nicknamed Staggers.
An evil place.
Yeah, infamously evil. At the other end, you've got a very conservative evangelical college in Oak Hill.
Also an evil place.
Right. And I would suggest that every college in the Church of England
is an evil place. Yes, I agree. That was exactly what I was building towards. Yeah.
But if you're to put colleges on a continuum on these kinds of issues, every single one of them will be somewhere on the line between those two colleges. For me, when this guy, if I was interviewing this guy or on the panel or whatever, and I found out that he's from Oak Hill, I mean, he's not even going to make it to the panel if I'm making any decisions, because
even if he is a nice community focused, someone who has kind of left of centre views, maybe is actually inclusive in various ways. If he has spent...
Not if he went to Oak Hill.
Well, but even if in some magic
even if he was, yeah.
2 to 3 years at a place like that is going to fundamentally shape a person in ways that are going to push them away from that, even if that's what they profess to believe.
And look, some people come out of that, like you did with the college you went to, Ben. Some people come out of that, and they're better people for it.
Sorry, no, strong disagree. I wasn't better. I might have come out a better person than I might have been, but I wasn't better for it. Let's be very clear.
But you're a better human being for it because you're less of a now somehow. That's hard to believe, but...
Yeah, I think I'd be a better human being with less therapy bills, but anyway.
No, well, look, I'm not saying you're leading a better life, right? I'm sure life is much harder for you than it would have otherwise been. What I'm saying is, probably, you hold fewer nasty reactionary beliefs.
I think you're right, but what I will say is that as someone who was there and was mostly, I'm not as left as I am now, either on social or economic issues, but was coming in as someone on the left.
Hang on, what did you just say? You're not as left now as you were.
No, other way round. When I went to that,
I was like, we're going to have to disband the podcast.
When I went to that place to do my degree, I was inclusive in terms of my, theology towards the LGBTQ plus community, and kind of, I would probably describe myself as being more in that kind of liberal theology category, but, was to the left of the average person there. And over my time there, in a lot of ways, I drifted further to the left. I certainly didn't lose any of those. But being in that place where, particularly around social issues, right, the conversations you're having are essentially, in the realm of, are gay people even human? Do we have to treat them that way? And whilst I was obviously opposing that, simply by being in the place where those were real topics of conversation, you almost close yourself off from thinking in ways that are more liberatory, more radical, whatever. So, I know from experience that being in these sorts of places, and, that is the religious right at work, right? Even if you still retain a support for gay marriage, you are shaped by the discourses of having to defend that viewpoint against opinions well to the right of that, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting, the report makes it clear that the furthest left the evangelical Christian goes in the UK is the centre-left. And what I want to know is, if they weren't evangelical Christians, would of those centre-left people, would some of them been socialists? Yes, it is right to say that not all evangelicals are on the right, but is it a fundamentally rightward influence on your politics? It's very difficult to prove that either way. I don't know, but that's certainly a possibility.
There are definitely individual people who are, broadly evangelical and are actually socialists. They exist. But yeah, I think in general, you're probably right.
And the final kind of reason that the reports, or that I want to talk about, the report suggests there's no religious right in the UK, is that there is no direct tie to one political party. So in the States, obviously the religious right is essentially a wing of the Republican Party, and quite an influential and powerful wing of the Republican Party. Whereas in the UK, yes, they acknowledge the Conservative Christian Fellowship, but there's also a Lib Dem Christian group and a Labour Christian group and whatever else. And there is no sense that the Christian Conservative Fellowship is any more influential or powerful or whatever than it is in these other parties. So is that the religious right? And that's really upset you.
It's stupid. It's so stupid. Any casual kind of engagement with the history of fascism would lead a person to understand that a right-wing political movement doesn't need to be directly related to a single political party from the outset, right? Mm-hmm. Things grow out of things.
Yeah. But I also think more fundamentally than that, what is the role of each of these Christian groups? It is to have a Christian voice within those parties. And we know that, for example, on the issue of abortion, that is not a party political issue in quite the same way. Yes, you're more likely to have an anti-abortion stance in the Conservative Party. That makes sense. But it is not like the Labour Party is united on being pro-abortion, or even the Lib Dems, which is crazy because what are you even? You're liberals. This is like bread and butter stuff. But anyway, even they are not united on the issue of abortion, right? And part of the role of these Christian groups is to push anti-abortion narratives, right? It is absolutely mad to me that parties allegedly on the left would allow free votes for their MPs on issues of abortion because they're supposedly issues of conscience. Well, first of all, you probably should be voting on your conscience on everything, but I've seen enough of the Labour Party to know that most of them don't have consciences. But, secondly, this is a basic human right. This is something that is absolutely tied to, not even leftism, but basic liberalism, right? Like having the right to have your own say over your body. But it is the Christian groups in these organisations, and to some extent other religious groups, but for a way, way less of an extent, it is these Christian groups that kind of keep the parties not committing wholeheartedly to issues like anti-abortion. I think even the same-sex marriage vote was a free vote, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And we've spoken about MPs before that Labour MPs that were implacably opposed to same-sex marriage and were welcomed back happily into the fold afterwards, rather than cast into the fiery lake as they will eventually be. But Christian groups exert an influence on the politics of this country, and in quite a direct way, right? These Christian groups of MPs essentially organise to work within their own parties, and probably cross-party as well, around certain cultural war issues, particularly abortion. So I hope that we're kind of coming to a quite clear conclusion here, which is to say that there is absolutely a religious right in the UK that is coming from the same currents and forces and is working to broadly the same goals as the US religious right, but in practice looks very different than the American religious right for reasons of economy and culture. So, yeah, absolutely a force within British politics, and one that I think we should be increasingly concerned about. And just because it's not as blatant or overt as the American version of it does not mean it's not still a dangerous participant in political life.
I also think we're kind of at the point now where it's not even just that we should be concerned about it, it's that we need to take active steps to prevent its, well, not its emergence, it's already here, but it gathering momentum. Because it will do that, and is doing that, alongside the sort of increased kind of fascist turn, not just in the UK, but in a lot of countries globally. I mean, there's fascists in a lot of places at the moment, and in a lot of places in power at the moment. So we're going to see more of it, and we need to prevent it.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think that will do us for this week. Thank you very much, Adam, for joining me. And thank you for listening to us. We love to hear from people. So if you have any thoughts, ideas, questions, suggestions, complaints even, please do get in touch with us. Contact details are in the description, or they're on our website, breadandrosaries.com. There's a Patreon link there as well if you're interested in supporting us financially, or if you don't want to support us financially, then that's obviously absolutely fine. Rating and reviewing us on podcast platforms is also a nice way to support us. Adam, where in the world can people find you?
You can find me most places, TikTok and Blue Sky are probably the ones I'm sort of mostly focusing on these days, at Commie, XIAN.
Cool. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Thank you, Adam, and we'll see you next week.
See you later.
Bye.
Get it all. I got my heart sound blasting through my speakers now. I got a whole town feeling the vibration now. Got a hot girl stepping through the beat right now. Hey, do it all. I don't want much, I just wanna turn it up. I got many options, but I choose to roll on myself, and I love it when I'm vibing hard. Hey, I just wanna be so stylish. I just wanna be unlardish. Never wanna be like artists. Rather be on crazy fashion. Rather not be in movies. That'll be like all these actors. Better go live your life. You done got too much time. You're looking at me, wanna be like hype. I didn't really get it when it never started fight. Only gonna focus on myself, on my sound. Every single time I drop a line. If that's the only good visit, I'm alive, then it's gonna be enough. I'm good.